Should I do those three quickly?
Do those, please.
Women's rights and indeed human rights more generally. I mean, just to be clear, I didn't suggest that the Taliban would re-enter government. I know others are suggesting that. I think I hope I've made clear I personally take a rather cautious view on that, if you like, the political deal as opposed to a balanced political settlement within Afghanistan. But in his interview the other day, President Karzai, I think, was pretty clear on this, that the red lines are respect for the Afghan constitution, no support for al-Qaeda, and giving up violence as a political tool. I mean, he uses his own words, but fundamentally, and of course that will have resonances for the domestic situation. Those essentially are the red lines. Now, within the Constitution is absolutely clear on human rights generally and the rights of women. It is important, of course, to understand that the delivery of human rights and the delivery of women's rights, again, particularly in rural areas, in poorly educated communities, is way short of the aspiration the Afghan constitution sets out. And that isn't only true in the south and the conflict areas, it's true right the way through the country. And of course, one of the issues in which I and others were engaged earlier this year were various pieces of legislation going through the Afghan parliament which looked as though they were going to be retrograde for women's rights. So women's rights is going to be a big issue within Afghanistan for a long time to come, the actual delivery of women's rights, even if on the assumption that the Constitution, the constitutional provision remains firm, because there is a gap between delivery and if you like, that constitutional guarantee. The right way to deal with that is the way that we deal with it in many other societies that are developing, where across Africa, many other countries, women live at disadvantage or under oppression, and that is through development, education, gradual improvement in prosperity, and that is the way I think we'll gradually improve this in Afghanistan. So we shouldn't just see women's rights as an issue between the Taliban and the mainstream. It is an issue within the mainstream as well, and it's important that we don't forget it. In terms of the economic question, and hopefully that in a sense touches your question as well. Sorry, what
are you prepared to offer Taliban? You're going to have to negotiate with Taliban. What are you offering them?
Well, we aren't offering them anything. In the end, it's for the Afghan government to offer them. And essentially what they're offering them is a route back into legitimate political and economic life.
Listen, at the moment,
on conditions.
At the conference at the moment, it's money. That seems crazy.
Well, it's not. That's a reintegration program to essentially address this question someone else was asking about, which is to bring fighters out of the fight and get them into jobs and so on. It's not just money. Nobody is really talking about just handing over checks to individual fighters or individual commanders, although there may be an element of that on a temporary basis, just to get a ceasefire and get people out of the fight. But in the end, the money has to go to getting these guys jobs, getting them educated, and getting them back into the mainstream, which takes us back to essentially the development and stabilization agenda. And most of the money that is likely to be committed to reintegration and reconciliation would actually go through those mechanisms, things like the National Solidarity Program, which is a development program. So in your answer, what is the offer? Well, as I say, it's for the Afghan government.
Said connected with Northern Ireland. Had you offered money to the IRA, it wouldn't have got far.
Well, as I said, we shouldn't drive the parallels too far. I mean, the difference being that people don't have jobs and so on there. That's part of the reason that people are in the insurgency. But the offer is essentially a route back into the political and economic mainstream, into legitimate life where they can go back to their families, they can farm, they can have a job, and they're not outside. It's not the kind of political compromise that the first question of that set was asking about. And of course, in the long term, it is that international forces, once there is no longer an insurgency to address, will reduce and step back into a training and supporting role, not a combat role. And of course, that means we would no longer be out there fighting within the villages, which of course nobody, neither us nor the people of that area, want. But that's not part of a deal. That's the prospect for a peaceful Afghanistan that's out there. In terms of the economic development, I mean, economic growth, for example, has been very strong. Now, it's double digit. It was double digit in 2009. I can't remember the exact number. It's been 6 to 8% generally. Sorry?
Why?
Well, partly because of aid, partly because the private sector has picked up, partly because there have been there's been agricultural development, and some of that's good harvests, and there'll be good years and bad years, but just economic growth gradually has picked up, and we get very focused, particularly in the UK, on Helmand and the south, because that's where our forces are, and of course that's where the news organisations focus their attention. For those of you who ever go to Afghanistan, it is well worth travelling to Herat or Mazar-e-Sharif and parts of the north, where you don't have HESCO barriers absolutely everywhere, you don't have guards on every building, and Mazar-e-Sharif, for example, is a Central Asian city, like many others, where you see economic activity going ahead, and that's essentially the opportunity that the south and east can aspire to, if the conflict ends, if they're stabilised, which again, in a sense, goes to the previous question. But I mean, as you know, these are very overquoted statistics, but it's worth just registering the number of children in school, in primary school, including the number of girls in primary school, access to healthcare. All of those numbers have headed in the right direction, and quite radically in the right direction over the past few years. So I think there has been genuine progress.
Regionally, though, mostly in the north.
Variable, but I mean, every area is up, but obviously it's variable, and of course this goes back to this distinction between stabilisation and development. You can't really address Afghanistan as a poor country until we've addressed Afghanistan as a conflict-ridden country, and that's got to be our task for the next year or 18 months. That's probably a good point at which to finish.
I think that is the point to finish. I think you should show your appreciation to Mark, who's done a fantastic job.